So thank you all for coming this morning, and so we're going to talk about the Portfolio Interest Exemption Program. This program allows non-U.S. investors to earn income in the United States by making investments into the United States. However, their income that they're earning from those investments is not subject to U.S. withholding tax. That is a savings of anywhere from 30 to 40% of taxable income to most non-U.S. investors. As an example, you have a non-U.S. investor who buys a piece of property in the United States. They hold it for a couple of years, they sell the piece of property. When they sell the property, the title company usually withholds a 30 to 40% withholding tax until they have actually filed their income tax and paid the taxes on the income they earned from the sale of the property. This program negates all that. And so it's a great program for non-U.S. citizens to invest in the U.S. So let's get into the details of it. How did this come about? Well, non-U.S. investors are not subject to this withholding tax on the U.S. source because it's been defined in the IRS statutes, particularly sections 871 and 881 in the Internal Revenue Code, amended in 1986, that a non-U.S. investor can invest and earn money without tax withholding under certain conditions, and we're going to go through those conditions. But this is an Internal Revenue Code 871, 888 as amended in 1986. You might also check into or look into the code section 864B2. That's also applicable to this. So if anyone that wants to know the legality of this program, those are the codes in the Internal Revenue Code source that they need to look at and read about. So basically, through Regulation S is a vehicle through this U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and acts as a safe harbor for a non-U.S. citizen to invest in the United States and have their money come in directly from their country of origin without having to register that money through a registration service like the SEC or like a state securities or like the Internal Revenue Service, or in many cases, what has happened in the past, a non-U.S. investor would have to actually open a U.S. business, get a EIN number for that U.S. business, and then buy or make investments through that U.S. business. That's really onerous for the person, and this negates all that. This kind of like bypasses that. They can go directly into a direct investment through Regulation S, which is filed with the SEC. We at A-List Partners have all of our funds. We have an overlay Regulation S on top of all of our funds to allow investors to invest directly into our funds. And by doing so, they are also they could invest directly into a Portfolio Interest Exemption vehicle or document of some sort. So, moving along on that, the actual investments that they have to consider when they are moving money into the portfolio interest, it has to be a fixed rate of return. And it has to be either a monthly or quarterly payment on that fixed rate of return. So the only way for them to really benefit from it is to either do a whole note. In other words, they become a lender. So they are lending money against, say, a piece of real estate, and then it becomes a whole note that they own against that piece of real estate. So their investment is secured by real estate, by note and deed of trust in the United States, as well as through a Regulation S subscription agreement, which is managed and serviced by the fund and the managers of the fund. They could do fractionalized notes. In other words, 10 of them could get together and decide they want to put 1/10 of the value each into a project. I'm not a big fan of fractionalized notes, and so I personally don't like doing them. They could do it. We're open to discussing it with them, but it is not an option I really want to explore. Another possibility is that they do what's called a debenture. A debenture is like a corporate note. It becomes senior debt owed by the corporation, in this case, A-List Partners Regional Center. It becomes a senior debt of the Regional Center, And because it's senior debt, it takes precedence over the equity investors in our fund. So again, they have security of having a senior debt instrument over the equity investors in the fund. And that's a really strong security. Again, your vehicle for unloading onto that is through a Regulation S subscription agreement. And then lastly, which if you have a lot of money to invest, when I say a lot of money, I would say $1 million or more, you probably want to consider doing what's called a line of credit vehicle. And in the line of credit vehicle, the way that would work is we work as a co-lender with the foreign investor, or the non-US investor, and we allow them to do underwriting with us on the project that we're considering lending money against. And if they like the project and they want to make the loan, it goes on their line. In other words, they fund it from their line of credit, and they actually have an assignment of the note and deed of trust that is assigned to their line of credit, which means they have the control of that asset, and we then become the manager of their asset, and we service their loan to make sure that the borrower is then paying their fair share of interest to the lender, in this case the non-US investor. So those are the ways that we can work with a non-US citizen to help them through the Portfolio Interest Exemption program. Again, the instrument must be a fixed rate of return. If it's fixed rate, it's not subject to withholding on the US side, no withholding tax. And they must maintain their status as a non-resident alien in the United States. We're going to go through that in a minute. And then there's specific language that's required in the Regulation S subscription agreement and in the note to allow them to qualify for the Portfolio Interest Exemption program. Our securities attorney is very meticulous about the language in these documents to protect the non-US citizen in their investment. So we go out of our way to make sure that we are fully compliant with the laws of the United States to protect the non-US citizen in their investment. So as a non-US investor, they must maintain their status as a non-resident alien. So what does that mean exactly? Well, if they're going to invest through a corporate entity, like our equivalent of a corporation or an LLC or partnership, that entity must be incorporated or established in the country of origin. It cannot be a U.S. established entity. Even though the money may be coming from offshore, they cannot be taking offshore money, putting it into a U.S. entity, and then making an investment from the U.S. entity. So it has to be an offshore, completely incorporated from the country of origin. They cannot have a permanent residency card in the United States. That would negate them. No green card, no permanent resident card. They can have certain visas, but they can't have an H-2 visa. In other words, they can't have a work visa in the United States and qualify for this. They have to go through what's called a substantial presence filter in the United States. Substantial presence means that they're limited on the number of days that actually live in the U.S. Now, if they're just visiting the U.S., like a tourist, and come here, 30 days every few months, something like that, or a couple of weeks every few months, or a couple of days every few months, they're fine. But if they try to move to the U.S. and set up residency, and they stay here for a few months at a time, they're going to violate their non-resident alien status. So that would violate and negate them from the Portfolio Interest Exemption program. By maintaining their alien status, their non-resident alien status, they have to maintain that exemption, or they have to maintain that substantial presence and make sure they don't violate that. There are some exemptions to substantial presence. Those exemptions are if the person happens to hold certain visas. So if they have a teacher visa, which is a Q visa, or a trainee visa, which is a J visa, or a student visa, like an F visa, then that is an exemption from that residency status. So they can reside in the United States and still qualify for the Portfolio Interest Exemption program. So the visas that are exempt, again, are your F, J, M, and Q visas. Those are the visas that are exempt from the from the substantial presence. There is also a closer connection exemption that has to be followed. So closer connection means that, let's say that they have a relative here in the United States who has a business, and the person who lives in China wants to invest or lend money to that business through the Portfolio Interest Program. They cannot do it because there has to be the connection between the lender, which is the non-U.S. resident alien, and the beneficiary, the person receiving the money. There cannot be any familial connection whatsoever. They must also maintain a home in their country of origin. Okay? And lastly, they must also make the country of origin their tax country. They have to pay their taxation in their country of origin. So that's the connection things that need to be looked at when they're considering getting into this program. Other eligibility issues that they need to look at is there can't be any relationship between the borrower and the lender. I've talked about that, but when I say any, I mean any, whether it be brother, grandfather, great uncle, stepsister, whatever the relationship is. If there's any familial relationship whatsoever, they cannot become involved with their investment into something. It cannot come from a bank or financial institution. So there may be a bank. We were recently approached by a bank in Czechoslovakia, and they wanted to move $100 million into the United States through this program. Well, it can't be done because they're actually a bank. So we said, thank you, we'd love to have your money, but we just can't take it under this program. Now, if you want to invest in the fund, be glad to take it. And then there's a 10% ownership test. What that means is, let's go back to the example of the person who had a relative here who had a business, and then, let's say Lance lived in the United States and Roberto lived in Mexico, and Lance asked Roberto if he could borrow money to keep his business going, and Roberto contacted us and said, I want to become a lender through the Portfolio Interest Exemption Program, but by the way, I own 25% of Lance's company. Well, you can't. That negates your possibility. There's a 10% maximum rule that any U.S. citizen cannot own more than 10% of the entity, or that any non-U.S. citizen cannot own more than 10% of a U.S. entity to which they're lending money. Okay? Now, if Lance were a relative of yours, you couldn't do it anyway. And some others to look at is the corporation itself cannot be foreign controlled. In other words, you cannot have an entity in China which is owned by 90% owned by investors in the United States who are U.S. citizens. It just won't work. So the entity, if it's a non-person entity, meaning a corporation or an LLC or partnership or whatever they have in that country of origin, then the shareholders or stockholders or members cannot own more than 10% of that entity. And then a non-U.S. investor cannot engage in business that is directly involved in the loan. Let's go back to Lance has a business, and let's say that Lance is building an apartment complex, and he goes to Roberto in Mexico and says, I want to borrow money through this program. And Roberto says, great, would love to lend you the money, but I want you to use my cement company that I own in Texas to use to build the apartment complex. So there cannot be any trade association that is stipulated. A force of using a business that you may already own cannot happen and still qualify for this program. And there cannot be, a non-U.S. investor may not have a business-related loan to that investment. Again, the apartment complexes, let's say that Roberto had already lent money to Lance to build the apartment complex outside of this program, and he wanted to recapture it by putting all of that into this program. Sorry, you can't do it. So you have to be real careful on these exclusions and eligibility issues. Now, what we do at A-List Partners is we scrutinize the investment, we underwrite the investment, and then we work with you to go through every single eligibility issue to make sure that you are not violating any issues so that you're fully compliant with the program. Because once you're fully compliant with the program, you will never have any problems with the U.S. government about not paying taxes on the income you earn. And that's real important to understand. We are going to be there to we become your compliant officer because we want you to be successful, and the only way for you to be successful is to follow the laws. And if you follow the laws, everyone's happy, you're successful, we're successful, and you're going to continue doing business with us through this program. Now, if you get involved in this program, you may still own property in the United States that will not, does not be an issue for you, and it will not be an eligibility issue. You can own as much property as you wish to buy. You can have a TIN number, or you can have an ITIN number, and you may pay taxes on other income in the United States. Again, that will not negate your participation in this program. And lastly, which is something new to the program, you can actually have a bank account in the United States, which is huge because it used to be the money had to be wired back to the country of origin. Well, a lot of people who are investing in the U.S., they understand the U.S. is a safe harbor for their money. It's one of the strongest economies in the nation, in the world. So they want to keep their money here. So we can help facilitate opening bank accounts for non-U.S. citizens, and we can make your deposits on your interest income into those bank accounts for you. And the money can stay here in a U.S. bank, and you can build up your cash reserves here in the United States. So we become a safe harbor for your investment. And I think that's real important to know. The beautiful thing about this program is it's really more simple than it sounds. But it's important that people understand the program and realize that we do this program day in and day out, and therefore we are very aware of the rules and regulations and the eligibility for the program, and we work with you hand in hand. We become your employee per se, because you're not paying us to do this, but we are making sure that you're compliant on every level of the law, and we service your loan for you, and we manage your asset for you. But we only follow your direction on that asset management. So the asset is yours, the note deed of trust is yours, we service it for you, make sure that we're collecting the interest payments from the borrower, and make sure that you're paid every month or every quarter, however we structure the note. And that's exactly how we run this program. It is a lot more simple than it sounds, but it's because we do it all the time and we understand it very, very well. So that's basically the program in a nutshell, and we would love for you to consider becoming an investor in the United States through the Portfolio Interest Tax Exemption Program. Any questions? Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope that I will send you a copy of a PowerPoint later, and if you have questions later, please email me or call me, and I'll go through them with you.